It is that iconic image of the mushroom cloud that still reminds many people of the Cold War's nuclear arms race and the pervasive fear of nuclear annihilation. More than 60 years ago, the camera captured the testing of one of the first nuclear weapons over the southwestern desert of the United States. 2 American bombs had vaporized Hiroshima and Nagasaki to bring the Second World War to a close. Later, Americans and Soviets learned to fear each other. Children were taught to crouch under their desks and practice air raid drills, as if that would protect them from the unseen effects of radiation. Even as nuclear energy was being brandished as a weapon of mass destruction, it was also being promoted as a peaceful tool, as a clean and virtually unlimited source of electric power generation. But then, 2 nuclear power disasters, in 1979 at the 3 Mile Island plant in the United States and in 1986 at the Soviet reactor in Chernobyl, reignited public fears of radiation exposure. Russian scientist and environmentalist Alexei Yablokov is an expert on radiation and nuclear safety. He says Chernobyl spewed 1,000 times more radioactive particles into the atmosphere than 3 Mile Island, and the Soviet government wasted valuable time by covering up the disaster for 36 hours after the first explosion. Thousands of lives were lost, he says, and the human toll is still apparent 25 years later.
Several generations will be impact of Chernobyl, genetical damage, health damage, and so on. It's huge. It's impossible to forget Chernobyl.
And now Japan's nuclear disaster at the Fukushima reactor complex has once again raised radiation anxiety around the globe. Are these fears realistic? Gerald Epstein of the American Association for the Advancement of Science says it may surprise many people to know we are immersed in a sea of low-level radiation.
All life on the planet has evolved with that around. Human life has been living with that sort of radiation all around. Whatever effects that has, they've always been there. And the question is, are we at any increased risk from what might be released from the reactor? In almost every situation, whatever the increased risk is, it's very, very small.
Every time passengers go through security and board the airplane, they are exposed to radiation. As the plane goes higher in altitude, those same passengers get another minuscule dose from cosmic rays in the atmosphere. Epstein says there is natural radiation in the stones we use to build our buildings and homes, and in the soil that surrounds them. There is radiation from medical technologies such as X-rays and CT scans, and even from the potassium found in some fruit and vegetables.
Some fraction of all the potassium we eat is actually a radioactive form, and that radiation from this form of potassium forms some of the background exposure we're exposed to all the time.
Shortly after the nuclear disaster in Japan, many pharmacies in the U.S. reported receiving calls from Americans requesting potassium iodide capsules, which they believed would protect them from the radioactive iodine present in nuclear power plant emissions. Again, Gerald Epstein.
I don't think in either case there's any harm, but the harm they're avoiding may not be as much as the quote harm that actual pill would take.
Epstein predicts that many countries will be taking a hard look at their plans to build nuclear reactors in the immediate future. If those nations turn away from nuclear energy, he says, other sources of electricity must be found, sources with potential public health risks of their own. And it will once again be up to the public to decide what level of risk it can tolerate.
The catastrophic failure of Japan's Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant following the March 11th earthquake and tsunami spotlighted a terrible risk of generating electricity with nuclear reactors. It also focused renewed attention on the dangers of keeping the reactor's highly radioactive spent fuel in temporary storage on site. Over the past 6 decades, the world has built some 400 nuclear plants, and none of them has a permanent, long-term storage plan for this lethal waste. Linda Gunter is an international specialist at Beyond Nuclear, a Washington-based environmental group.
The nuclear waste problem has never been solved, and there's a strong possibility that it never will be solved. And therefore we talk about it as the Achilles heel of the nuclear industry.
Around the world, nuclear waste sit at the reactor sites, either in deep, water-filled concrete pools or in steel reinforced cement casks located just outside the reactor buildings.
In the case of the Fukushima design, which is the GE Mark I reactor, of which there are 23 in the United States, that fuel in the pool is sitting on the roof of the building outside containment, vulnerable to attack, to breach. You know, if there's any kind of an accident that opens up that fuel pool, that inventory gets released to the environment. That's a lot of radioactivity.
Nuclear industry experts say the dangers of on-site waste storage have been greatly exaggerated by critics. The Nuclear Energy Institute, NEI, is a major political voice for the industry in the United States. Adrian Hamer is Executive Director of NEI's strategic programs.
The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has estimated it's safe for another 100 years at the site in the locations where it is, whether it's in the fuel pools or whether it's in dry cask storage.
This is a dry cask or reinforced concrete container of nuclear waste at the San Onofre nuclear plant located in Southern California. Inside that thick cement casing is a large quantity of radioactive waste, just walking distance from the reactors. It's just a fraction of the 70,000 metric tons of nuclear waste that the U.S. nuclear plants have produced over the past 60 years, according to the U.S. Government Accounting Office. NEI's Adrian Hamer says because of recent events at the damaged Fukushima plant, where exposed uranium waste has leaked large amounts of radiation, there is renewed interest in the United States in moving waste from 104 operating reactors at 67 sites around the country out of water-filled pools into dry cask storage and then to an interim off-site storage location.
I think with the events in Japan, it's important that we get on with and move forward with this interim storage activity as soon as possible so we can start moving fuel away into a safer location as opposed to having it spread around at 104 or 67 actually at different sites.
In 2002, the U.S. seemed on the verge of a permanent nuclear waste storage solution. The U.S. Congress gave the go-ahead to the Yucca Mountain project to develop a deep subterranean nuclear waste burial site about 160 kilometers from Las Vegas, Nevada. The project has been controversial from the start. Critics say transporting nuclear waste to Yucca Mountain would be too risky. In early 2009, after several $1 billion had already been spent constructing the underground facility, President Obama called a halt to the project. The future of the Yucca Mountain nuclear waste site remains unclear. Adrian Hamer at NEI believes Yucca Mountain is still a viable option, and attempts to close it, he says, are being driven by political, not technical issues. But until such large permanent storage sites can be developed, the world's 400 nuclear reactors will continue storing their nuclear waste close to home. And according to Chris Flavin, president of World Watch Institute, an environmental watchdog group in Washington, the waste storage issue is a big problem for nuclear power advocates.
The fact that the Japanese were actually storing nuclear waste, which they had no other way of dealing with on the site, and that has sort of contributed to the severity of the accident and the long-term consequences, I think that is going to be, one of the big additional drags on nuclear power going forward.
The average life of a nuclear power plant is 40 years. According to the Nuclear Energy Institute, 61 plants in the U.S., roughly half the total, are seeking relicensing to extend their operations for another 60 years. Approval of those licenses might well hinge on the public's hope that the nuclear waste storage problem will eventually be solved. This is Zulima Palacio, VOA News.
Japanese officials say radiation has been found in groundwater under the damaged Fukushima nuclear plant, but they say drinking supplies remain untouched. The government says the evacuation of residents from areas near the plant will be long-term. It is reported the government is planning to buy shares in the Tokyo Electric Power Company, the plant's operators.
And Al Jazeera has found some of those forced to move to temporary shelters are living in wretched conditions, in some cases with no power and no running water. You can find